Well, my name's Elizabeth Rogers, but my maiden name was Elżbieta Kirkor. That was my maiden name. Elżbieta is Elizabeth, and I was born in Warsaw, 6th of February 1938, just a year and a half before the Second World War broke out. And I don't remember anything of Poland because I was 1.5 when the war broke out. My family, my dad worked for the government, so we escaped with the government en masse, driving at night and hiding in forests during the daytime because the Germans were looking for us. And we escaped through Romania and then through northern Italy into France. And then when France fell in June of 1940, we were in Angers, by the way. We were in Angers, and my mother would take us to Les Sables d'Olonne. She loved swimming, so we'd go there. But then when France fell, we left in a great hurry from Bordeaux in a boat called the Madura. And we went up the west coast of France to the English Channel, and we had to zigzag. It was a Filipino boat, and they separated the men from the women. And my mother said it was touching because the Filipino sailors had very little rice, but what they had they shared with us because they saw we didn't have food with us. And so we had to zigzag because of the submarines, and we landed in Falmouth, England, and the first night they put us up on we had to sleep on the floor of a movie house. And from there we made our way somehow to London, and then Dad stayed in London because that's where the Polish government in exile was quartered, and for safety he sent us to Scotland, and I don't remember that either. And then from Scotland we took a Polish boat called the Stefan Batory to Halifax, Nova Scotia. And the funny thing is that I always thought we somehow ended up just in Montreal, but the reason I know now that it was Halifax was because the family of my nanny found me through Facebook about 2 years ago maybe. I got a message from a young woman with a very Scottish name like McGregor or something, not Polish at all, asking me whether I knew anything about the family named Kirkor. And I said, well, yes, I am a Kirkor. I'm Elizabeth Kirkor. My parents were Stanislav and Irene. And she wrote back saying, well, my grandmother was your nanny. So the nanny crossed the Atlantic with my mother because she saw that my mother wouldn't be able to cope. My mother, didn't really know she didn't know how to cook. She always had help, domestic help in Poland, so she didn't really know how to take care of us or what to do when one of us was ill. So the nanny said she'll cross over the Atlantic. This is now September, I think, 1940. So she said she'll cross the Atlantic and then go back to Europe. But she met a Polish Canadian. They fell in love. Staszewski was his name, I think. Her maiden name was Staszewska, and then she married. I've forgotten the name of the man she married. And anyhow, so there we are. And they found the document from that ship that lists all the passengers. And so they found the mother on that list. So anyhow, we spent a year or two in Montreal, and I have very, very vague memories. I just remember going through a wood. I don't know whom I was with, probably my mother. And this made a great impression on me because I'm an animal lover. And there was a horse, somebody had fallen off a horse, and the horse was lying on the ground, and it had barbed wire around its neck. And people were trying to keep the horses as quiet as possible so that somebody could come and get some shears and clip off the barbed wire. So I remember that. And then I remember another thing, and this is definitely my own memory because my mother by then had had a bad nervous breakdown, and she was in a hospital, and I was farmed out with one lady who had little twin boys, Felki, because Felix was the name of one, and so we called them the Felki, and my brother was farmed out with another lady. And I remember being in the playground, and somebody pushed my brother down the slide, and he went down so fast that when he left the slide, he hit his head on a concrete bench or something and was hurt. So I remember that. And I also remember a feeling of great injustice because I was farmed out with this lady. We called her Pani Mishka, Mrs. Mouse. I don't know why. She was a petite lady with dark hair. And her boys were very naughty. And at one point, they took some toys of mine. We were in an apartment, so we weren't on the ground floor. And they threw my toys out the window. And so when the mother came back and asked, who did this, they pointed at me. So she took down a curtain rod and beat me with it. She gave me a spanking. And I'll never forget that. There was this terrible sense of injustice. I don't even remember if it hurt particularly, just the sense of injustice that I was blamed for something that I hadn't done. So those are some of my earliest memories. And then at some point, we went to Forest Hills, Long Island. And there I have a lot of memories, because by then I was maybe 3 or 4. And my mother, one summer, rented a house in Larchmont and put me in a nursery school. And I escaped from the nursery school and went home, and I was swinging, because this house had a swing in the backyard. And I was in this swing when the neighbor saw me and realized I should be at school. So I think he either took me or told my mother, somehow contacted my mother, and I was hauled back to school. So that's another of my early memories. But in general, I have very happy memories of being in America, Forest Hills, 7010 108th Street, Forest Hills, New York. And I went to Our Lady Queen of Martyrs, a Catholic school. My brother went there as well. For a while, he was in a boarding school in Canada, because the nuns there didn't want to let him go because he was such a good pupil. They didn't want to let him go. So he stayed in Canada longer, and then he joined us in Forest Hills. And we lived in a building called the Continental. It's no longer there. Well, there is a building called the Continental, but the new building took up the entire garden. We had a huge garden. The building had a main building and 2 wings. It was covered in Virginia creeper, which turned red in the autumn. And it was only like 4 or 5 stories tall. And it had a huge garden with little Victory Garden, beautiful trees. It was really a lovely place to grow up, and I liked the school, and I got on well. I was very happy there. And we went to a Catholic church very close to Our Lady Queen of Martyrs. And I remember there was a Jewish bakery right opposite, and I'd go there, and they had a machine that made dough, and it churned the dough, great big blade churned the dough, and they made bagels and matzos. And so my mother always bought bagels and matzos, even though we're not Jewish, but we're Polish, and so a lot of the food is similar. And I remember waiting for the bagels. And I remember I had a little gang of friends, and our great thrill was to go around with an alarm clock, and we'd set the alarm for like the next 2 or 3 minutes, and we'd put it on the front doorstep, and we'd hide in the bushes. And the poor homeowner would hear an alarm outside his or her door, and open the door and just find this alarm clock. I don't know how we retrieved the alarm clock, but that was a great, great thrill. What else do I remember? I remember going to the beach. I think it was I've got some photographs of me in Larchmont, in the Larchmont Beach Club, yeah. And then other photographs I've got of my brother and me in the ocean at the Rockaways. A friend of ours, Mr. Przedpowski, had a cottage somewhere in the Rockaways, and we'd go there. And my mother was an excellent swimmer. So she'd swim way out. She never swam parallel to the beach. She was a very strong swimmer. She swam the crawl. She just closed her eyes and just swam perpendicular to the beach, way out. And I'd be sitting on the beach waiting for her. And these people would come up to me and say, "Little girl, what are you waiting for?" And I'd say, "Well, my mother's there swimming." And they'd look, and they couldn't see anybody, because she wore a white cap, and the white caps blended with her white cap. And they just assumed that my mother had drowned. So sometimes people would sit next to me waiting, and then bit by bit they'd see this woman emerge from the waves, like Venus from the waves, the birth of Venus. My mother's name was Irena Żaboklicka. She was born in 1906 in a part of Poland that is now Belarus. Her father, Stanislaw Żaboklicki, was the estate manager for an aristocratic family called the Branickis. And they owned a beautiful chateau south of Warsaw, not far from the center of Warsaw, maybe half an hour or so by car. And it's a lovely little palace. It sort of started out like Versailles, a little hunting lodge. But Versailles grew bigger and bigger and bigger, whereas Wilanów stayed rather small and intimate. And it's a beautiful place. It's all the tourists who go to Poland go to Wilanów. And the Żaboklicki family had a house practically opposite the front gates. It was a lovely house with those oxbow windows and the sloping roof and a lot of space. And my mother had 3 brothers, an older brother, a middle brother. So the older brother was Zygmunt. The middle brother was Zbigniew or Zbyszek. And she had a twin brother called Jerzy, which is George, Jerzy. And so she grew up a bit like a tomboy. She swam in the moat or the lake. She rode the horses that belonged to the Branicki's. She was very, very, very popular with them all. And she had the run of this little chateau. And in fact, my sons John and Roland, when they were in their 20s, in 1988, my mother took us on a tour of Poland, and we visited Wilanów, and they loved it. It's very precious, very beautiful, very well taken care of. And whenever there's a foreign leader who comes to Poland, the government houses them in Wilanów, and it's been beautifully restored and kept like a little jewel. And it's full of paintings and furniture. And my mother especially remembered a ceiling which is painted with cherubim, but one of the cherubs has his legs sticking out. It's 3-dimensional, sticking out of the ceiling. The rest is 2-dimensional, just his little leg. So my mother always remembered that. So she had a very, very happy childhood, lots of relatives, aunts, uncles. She was popular with young men. She had a friend who played the piano and on the radio, and he would dedicate a song. He'd say, now I'm playing this Chopin, whatever, prelude or something, nocturne, for Irena Żaboklicka in Wilanów. And so in a way it was surprising that she married my father, because he was so completely different from all her friends. Her friends were, they were into yachting and canoeing and riding, and she went to a college called the SGGW, which in fact was founded by one of my father's uncles. SGGW was a very well-known agricultural school, so she knew a lot about gardening and agriculture, I suppose, yeah. She'd go on trips with schoolmates visiting gardens and different farms and whatever. So she had a very, very pleasant upbringing. But then there came a time, I suppose she was 26, when her family, and maybe my father's family, he was 8 years older, decided that they should get married. And my father had heard about this young lady in Wilanów, and they had family friends in common. And my father remembers when they got engaged. They got engaged, and my father remembers a lunch he had with one of his aunts who knew my mother better. She knew the Żaboklicki family, and he was having lunch with this aunt and saying how good it is he's marrying this Irena Żaboklicka from Wilanów. She's so domesticated and everything. There was a look of horror on the aunt's face, because she knew my mother wasn't domesticated. My mother was into playing tennis, going out with her friends. She had a sort of happy-go-lucky life. She adored her parents, she adored all her family. So anyhow, so they got married, and that must have been, 32, I think. It was 1932. They had a beautiful house built by a friend who was a very good architect, Nagórski, and he built a beautiful state-of-the-art house for them in the southern part of Warsaw, and it's still there. A lovely house with a big garden. And my mother loved swimming, so she asked the architect if he could do something about a swimming pool. Now, she knew that my father wouldn't agree, because he wasn't particularly into swimming, and he was financial advisor, so he didn't want to spend a lot of money on a swimming pool. So in secret, the architect had the workmen dig the foundations and cement them and then cover them in earth and put roses on top, so that eventually in the future all they'd have to do would be to dig the earth out. Of course, this didn't happen, because a year and a half later, a few years later, the war broke out. But anyhow, so they had that house from, I think it was built in 32. My brother was born in 33, and I was born in 1938, 5 years later, yeah. So 2 years ago, which would have been, 2012, I was in Poland with my son, middle son, Roland, and his wife and children, and we went to see the house. I had, in the interim, obtained some compensation. It took me 6 years, but I obtained some compensation, because the communist government took over the house. They took over all private property after the Second World War. And so I obtained some compensation, And the house is there, but it's empty. It's standing beautifully renovated and empty. And also, in the meantime, somebody had plonked a house down in part of the garden. The garden was very large, but still, there were two different plots, and somehow they managed to get a plot, and some English advertising agency built a house in what had been part of the garden. But the house is standing there, and funnily enough, a little old man came up to me as I was looking at this house with Roland and his family, and he was interested in why I was looking at the house. And I said, well, this was where I was born. And he said, oh, we've often wondered about this house because there was a Mr. Ochab living here. He was a horrible guy in the Polish communist government. I've forgotten what ministry he was head of, but he was horrid, Ochab. And so this little old man said, we call this the Ochabówka, that it once belonged to Ochab. We don't know why it's empty. Nobody's living in it. And he was very interested in my family history. And meantime, this guy had joined us, and he was 3 sheets to the wind. Yeah, and he started questioning me about what right do I have to ask these questions, what pretensions do I have to this house, what's it to me, that type of thing. And I asked him, to leave, and I'm talking to this elderly gentleman, please leave us alone. Well, he then came back, and he heard me speaking. He then came back, and he said, I don't believe your story. If you left when you were 1.5-year-old, you couldn't possibly speak such good Polish. Left-handed compliment, if anything. So anyhow, so that's it. So that's the story of the house. So it's been restored. But and my parents' initials are still over the door. They're in wrought iron. S.K. Stanislaw Kirkor, my father's name, and Irene Kirkor, my mother's name. Back to back, the initials are still in wrought iron over the front door. But at some point it had been used, I think, for some kind of a massage parlor, because I remember going there when I was trying to get the house back. The house had been divided up. One family lived on one side, one family on the other. The minister of something or other, I think Trade and Commerce, lived in half of it. And in what was the garage and some kind of a little addition, there was a neon silhouette of a naked lady. And it was a massage parlor. So I walked in there, and I asked, about massage, having a massage. And the man there looked at me very suspiciously, and he said, "This isn't the season for a massage." As if there had to be a season for massages. Then he got suspicious, and he said, "Do you represent the owners of this house?" And I said, "No." And inside I said, "I am the owner," but I didn't tell him. But he got suspicious, so I walked out. But when I was there with my mother, and when my children were small, I think John and Roland, Andy hadn't been born yet, and I was there with my mother, we went to that house, and a man let us in. He was a cocoa importer or something. He let us see half of the house. But on a previous occasion, when I was there alone in 1966, I was there with my husband in 66, the people who had the left side of the house said, "Oh, when you lived here, only one family lived here. Now, you see, under communism, we have 2 families living here," as if we had too much space. But my mother's mother-in-law lived with them, and they had servants who lived in an apartment part way down. So there was more than one family living there. Okay, my father's name was Stanislaw Kirkor. His mother was Zofia Grabska. That was her maiden name, and she was from a family of people who were heavily involved in politics. Her brother was premier of Poland on 2 occasions in the 1920s. Her other brother, Stanislaw, the older brother was Stanislaw Grabski. The one who was the premier was Władysław Grabski. Stanisław Grabski was a professor and also a minister of education, and in the Second World War he was in England. He met with Churchill. Churchill wrote about him very nicely in one of his memoirs about the war. And he was trying to negotiate for a just deal for Poland, which we, of course, didn't get at the Second World War, because we feel we were sold down the river by Stalin and by Roosevelt and by Churchill. We weren't really compensated for all the agony that Poland went through in the Second World War. But that's a whole other subject, which I shouldn't really get into now. It's a bit too complicated. Anyhow, so my father was Stanisław Kirkor, and his mother, Zofia Grabska, was a Polish socialist, very active in acting against the Tsar, because Poland had been, over 100 years, Poland had been divided up amongst the three big empires, the Prussian, the Russian, and the Austro-Hungarian. So my father was born, well, I'm jumping a bit here. So my grandmother, Zofia Grabska, was very active as a socialist, and she was rounded up once distributing literature to people about socialism and sort of anti-Tsarist newspaper. So she was rounded up and sent to a town, I'm pretty sure it was called Minsk. It's about 200 kilometers east of Moscow. I always thought she was sent to Siberia. No, she was sent to Minsk. And there she was allowed to rent an apartment, and she was in exile, but she had this little apartment. She taught French and art, I think, to the governor of that little enclave. She taught the children French, and she even sold some of her artwork, and she was supposed to be there for 2 years. But there she met, and maybe even in the train on the way there, she met a doctor, Dimitr Kirkor, and they fell in love. Well, he was engaged to somebody in Krakow, and so he didn't want to two-time this person. So he told my grandmother that, although they're in love, nothing will come of it. And this I only found out very recently, in the last few years. I didn't know anything about this, because she wrote in her memoirs that she was sick for a while. What happened was, out of despair that she wouldn't be able to marry him, she tried to shoot herself. I don't know where she got the gun. I have no idea. I only found out about this a few years ago from my cousin Maciej Grabski. And so her sister came to sort of help her, because obviously she missed, to help her. She wounded herself. So instead of staying there 2 years in exile, she was there for 1 year. But she continued when Dimitr Kirkor was liberated. They got married in Krakow. And I was always puzzled in her memoirs that the wedding didn't sound like a very happy one in her memoirs. And I think it was partly because maybe he felt guilty that, he'd jilted his first fiancée. I don't know, but the wedding didn't sound as if it was very happy. So they lived in Krakow, and they had one son. I've forgotten his name. Forgotten the name of the first child. The first son died when my father was about 3. So the first child was probably 5 when he died. He got scarlet fever and died, and my father survived. And then Dimitr Kirkor, unfortunately, died of a burst appendix, even though he was a doctor. He died of a burst appendix. And for about a year or a year or two, she traveled, and she met a man who was quite well known in Poland. He was the rector, I don't know how you'd say, dean, I suppose, of a school of art, I think. And she thought he was going to marry her and got her pregnant, and he didn't marry her. So she had some kind of a bit of a breakdown and was in a sanatorium, I think somewhere in Poland, when she met a man called Kedroń, Joseph Kedroń, and he fell in love with her. He was younger than her. She was very attractive. She was very pretty, and I've got a lovely, there's a portrait of her made in Paris by Olga Boznajska, where she was in her early 30s, I think. She traveled around for the 9 months that she was pregnant, and in her memoir she just said she traveled, but she didn't say why. And then she had the child, and she was very depressed because she had to give the child up, and Dimitr Kirkor found out that she'd given the child up in Switzerland or something like that, and he said, "What, a Polish citizen in Switzerland giving?" And he was very, very so in love with her that he went and got the child, and they got married, and they had 2 children together. Unfortunately, the child that she had with this rector died in 1920, just after the First World War ended. There was still fighting going on between the Poles and the Bolsheviks, and he died then. I think he had some kind of a brain fever or something like that. He died. But the child she had with Kedron, I met him. He was called, forgotten his name, doesn't matter.
Tell me a bit about her book, because all this information is going to be in her book, right?
Oh yeah, she wrote, yes. So she...
Title of it?
Yes. So my father and she were very, very close. She tried to keep him out of the First World War, but he lied about his age, and he said he was 16, he was only 15. So he took a small part in the First World War, but the war was coming to an end, so he didn't actually have to shoot anybody dead, but he did travel around in a uniform, and unfortunately he cuts that out of her memoirs. I don't know why. He edited her memoirs and cuts out that part. But they were very close, and he went to the university, the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, and he wanted to study history. He was an avid historian, but because he was born in 1898, and that part of Poland, Krakow, and the area around it was still part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, he wasn't allowed to study Polish history. In all those countries, they always tried to stamp out as much Polish learning about their own history or their language as they could. So he wasn't allowed to study history, so he studied economics. He studied economics, became an economist, and worked in Warsaw for the Polish Ministry of Finance. First of all, he was controller, city controller for the whole of Warsaw. And then he, just before the war began, he switched jobs and became head of one of the departments in the Ministry of Finance. That's why when the war broke out, he escaped with us, with the whole government. We escaped together. As I said, from Bordeaux to Falmouth, England, then to London. And for safety, he sent us to Scotland and then to Canada and the United States. And he stayed behind. And he told me he worked in a house called the White House. I have no idea where in London that is, funny enough. And they had to sleep away from the windows because there was bombing going on. The Germans were bombing London, and the windows were cracking and sending shards of glass. And Dad remembers sleeping away, as far away from the windows as he could. And so he stayed in London. He had an English teacher, an attractive woman who fell in love with him and who wanted him to abandon his family, to leave his family and marry her, and he refused. So I've got these photographs, which I'll show you. I've made these albums for you. I've got photographs of her, and but without her name, but I guessed that it was she. So Daddy stayed in England, and then he went over, once when my mother had her nervous breakdown, he had to go over to Canada. And of course, it was very dangerous. I mean, there were submarines in the Atlantic. So he made his way over, and then he made his way over in 1943 and in 44. The war ended in 45. In 43, he came just to see us, and he took my mother to Florida. And I was farmed out with the Nagurski family, and he took my mother to Florida. And then in 44, he came over because he was a member of the Polish delegation to the Bretton Woods Conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, that founded the World Bank and the Monetary Fund. And he was part of the Polish delegation. And my mother just loved being there because there was swimming and, you know, high society living and meeting important people and being in a beautiful, my mother always loved nature and, you know, walking in the woods or whatever. So she just thrived on being in Bretton Woods. And I must have been with, I don't know where I was, somewhere in Forest Hills. Somebody must have taken me in. So that's, so then the war ends in 45, and in 46, in July 46, we traveled, my mother, brother, and I traveled on the Queen Mary, which was still painted in her camouflage colors, and we traveled on the Queen Mary to Southampton, to England, July 46. And I remember that trip quite well. It was great being on this huge ship. And I remember that the wind was so strong in the bow of the ship that I used to go there and I used to just lie down and the wind would hold me up. I could just recline backwards like that and have the wind hold me up. It was so strong. And then at one point, my poor mother couldn't find us. She didn't know that my brother and I had gone to see a film, and I always remember this film. I found out later it was called The Stranger. It was with Orson Welles, and he plays some bad guy who comes from Europe during the war, and he's doing some spying, I think, for the Germans in America. And there's a scene at the end where he's cornered by the authorities, and it's in a church steeple. And the church has a clock, and when the clock strikes the hour, these figurines go around like this, and they're medieval. And one of the figurines is a medieval knight on horseback with a lance. And so there's Orson Welles. He thinks he's outwitted everybody. He's, safe up in this tower. And he's standing there sort of leering down at them. And the guy with the lance comes and pushes him off the tower. So I always remember, I was eight years old then. So my poor mother, meanwhile, not knowing that we were in the movie house, was racing around this huge ship looking for us. My mother always panicked whenever she thought we were lost. She had several nervous breakdowns later on. They were all based on her fear that something would happen to Andrzejek, my brother, Andrew, or me. Anyhow, so eventually she found us. So anyhow, so we landed in Southampton, and I remember looking out the porthole. We crashed a bit, so we demolished a bit of the pier, I think, and I look out through the porthole. And whereas America had always been technicolor and cheerful and joyful and people dressed in colorful clothes, everything to me looked gray. The water was gray, the pier was gray, the men were gray, their bicycles were gray, their funny cap, they had these little workman's caps. Everything was gray, the sky was gray. So England was a great shock to me. And then when I went to school, I was sent to Channing School. Oh yes, so Daddy took us, I suppose, in a taxi or something, and we went to Cranley Gardens, Muswell Hill, North London, and we pull up in front of this house. It's one of these houses, they look like cookie-cutter copies down a hill. All the houses look the same. And ours, thank God, was at the end of the row with a nice big tree next to it, but it was the top of the row. And I thought it was a joke. I thought Jaja, my father, pulled up in front of this house as a joke to show this ugly house to us, and then later on he was going to take us to a nice one-family home, and in my childish mind, I'd imagined it would look like the private houses in Forest Hills, with, a swing set and maybe a little pool, and here's this ugly house, which had been partially bomb damaged, and nothing had been painted during the war because everything went into the war effort, so nothing was painted. Later on, we found out that a bomb had fallen opposite the house, and that the plumbing underneath was cracked and had to be changed. And they had to put, and the front of it was damaged somehow. And I remember they had to put scaffolding along the front. Of course, as children, we loved it because we swung like monkeys from the scaffolding. Anyhow, so we pulled up in front of this house, and to my horror, we start unloading our suitcases and trunks. And we're upstairs. My father's first cousin from the Grafsky family, Auntie Ella, you knew her as Ciocia Ella, Auntie Ella. She and her husband, oh no, she hadn't arrived yet, that was it, she hadn't arrived. Her husband was there preparing the downstairs floor for the arrival of his wife and one of his 3 children. Only one of them came out. The other 2 stayed in Poland. And we had the middle floor and one little room at the top, which was a very primitive kitchen. And for at least a year or something, we had no refrigerator. My job was to run up and down the stairs, 3 or 4 flights of stairs, to the basement. We kept our butter and milk and meat in the basement. And I hated going there because that's where the coal was kept. And there was one light bulb hanging, and the coal looked so scary because it was parts of it shone in the dark, and it looked like eyes of some creature. And my uncle kept a big trunk of some kind of political papers that he didn't want the communists in Poland to get hold of. So there was this trunk, and as I went down the stairs, I always thought some hand would reach out and pull me into the trunk. But anyhow, so my job was to ferry the perishables up and down. So it was very hard on my mother, who'd been brought up in Poland with servants, then in America with a nice refrigerator, a nice, modern kitchen, and suddenly here she is with this primitive kitchen, no refrigeration. And it must have been much harder on her than on us. I mean, we kind of, enjoyed the scaffolding. I loved the garden. It was completely abandoned. The garden had grass growing about this tall and was full of snails. And I love animals, so I used to collect these snails and I used to race them. I used to put them in a row, and the little snails would sometimes climb on the backs of the big snails and cheat and win the race. So That I liked, but I was sent to a school called Channing, which is rather a high-class school up in Hampstead. We were near Highgate. That was our tube station, was Highgate. Highgate, and the main street was Muswell Hill. But the school was up high, and I used to walk there every day, up high on a level with Hampstead Heath and the town of Hampstead. And I remember several humiliating incidents because for gym, we wore a uniform. We had violet blouses and we had these brown tunics and a tie, brown tie. And when the girls got changed for gym, they had on these brown bloomers, these underpants, brown bloomers down to here. Well, I was wearing little Carter's underpants that all American children wore, little white underpants made by Carter's. So I'm looking at the girls changing for gym, and I'm not changing because I'm not wearing these strange brown things. So a girl walks up to me and says, "Well, why aren't you changing? Why aren't you changing for gym?" And I said, "Because I don't have any of those." So she went around. "That new girl, she doesn't have anything on underneath her tunic. Pass the word." And they all began laughing and chortling, and you know, at the age of 8, you want so badly to fit in. And in America, I was very happy. I fit in. I had my little gang. And here, suddenly, I'm the stranger. I'm either the American kid or the Polish girl. So a teacher comes up to me and says, "Elizabeth, aren't you wearing any bloomers?" I said, "Well, I'm not wearing those." And she understood, of course, that I did have something on. So that was one humiliation. Another humiliation was when one of the girls said, "Pass it around, Elizabeth." She must have come to my house, maybe I invited her for a meal or something. And she said, "Pass it around. Elizabeth's family drinks milk that's gone bad." Yogurt. The British had no idea what yogurt was. Or we made our own sour milk. My mother made sour milk, scooped off the cream and used it for making sauces or putting on strawberries or putting in a cake or whatever. But the British didn't know what yogurt was. So my life became a series of humiliations. And then another humiliation was in geography class. The girls knew that I was, came from America and maybe that I lived in New York. So the teachers asked me, she said, "Oh, Elizabeth, you must know this. What is the capital of the United States?" "New York, of course," I said, because it seemed like the most important city. And everybody laughed because, I don't know, they'd been taught earlier that Washington was the capital. So anyhow, I went from one humiliation to another. But I was a good student. So sometimes later on, when I changed schools and went to a school called Manor House School in Finchley, about a year. I think I only spent a year in Channing School, where I met my friend Celia, whom I'll talk about later. So I think I only spent a year in Channing. So maybe I was 9.5 or 10 when I went to Manor House School. And there the teachers would hold me up as an example. They'd say, "Here's this girl who doesn't speak English at home. And here she's coming in first in literature and first in English and whatever, history. Shame on you girls, who were born here." They could have hated me for that, but they didn't. We didn't have bullying in my school. That's why I'm so surprised when I hear about all the bullying that goes on nowadays. Because there was only one girl called Susan Livingston, so I'll never forget her name, in Channing School. She used to sort of hover over me. She was older than the rest of us. So let's say I was 8, 9, she was like 9 or 10. And she'd stand over me and she'd kind of look at me threateningly. And then when we crossed over quite a busy road to get from one section of Channing School, which still exists, by the way, Channing School, to the other section, she would make sure to walk behind me and tread on my heels so that my shoes would start coming off. But that was about what she did. I mean, she never punched me or anything, and never hurt me or whatever. So I enjoyed school. And at Channing, I met a wonderful girl who'd been born in India, Celia Thornley, who was she had sort of elfin look. She had dark curly hair and big dark eyes, and she was very funny, but she was naughty. She was always breaking all the rules. Every Saturday she had to come in and sit for an hour or something as a punishment. And only once did I have to do that. I was turned in by somebody, and it was unfair. I hadn't done something, but I was also punished. But that was the only time. I was a bit of a goody-goody. But she was fun. So we got on well, because I'd just come from America, so I was kind of different. And she'd only been in England for a year, because she was born in India. Her father was in the army. He was also a cotton importer or something, Frank Thornley. So our families became great friends. My mother and her mother, Ruth Thornley, got on extremely well. And later on, my mother's older brother, Zygmunt, after the war ended, met Ruth, and he kind of really liked her very much. She was a very attractive, intelligent woman, also born in India. So Celia became my best friend after only that 1 year, that school in Channing. But our families kept inviting each other. And every summer I'd go out and spend at least a month, because they moved. They moved from Finchley, Bishop's Avenue, Finchley. Celia always said it was the wrong end of Bishop's Avenue because they were very fancy houses, and her house was maybe slightly less fancy. It was still beautiful, but she said it was the wrong end of Bishop's Avenue. And they moved to the country, so they lived in Goudhurst, Kent, and they had a beautiful house there that was like part of a dating from the 1600s, so the floors were uneven but very highly polished. And there were big inglenook fireplaces where they used to roast an ox or something. So it was a beautiful house full of these nooks and crannies and a lovely orchard and a garden. And sort of kitty corner to it in Goudhurst, there was a pub called what was it called? The Something Arms. And the hop pickers who came from East London with their accents, they spoke like that, they spoke Cockney. They'd come, their whole families, father, mother, maybe 5 or 6 children, and they'd have these little, I could hardly call them a cottage, but a little sort of a living space with a big bed where they all slept, and they picked hops, which made beer. And Kent was famous for their hops. The fields were full of hops, sort of stretched out on ropes. And they had these oast houses, beautiful oast houses with a conical shape at the top with a weather vane, and it would go around according to which way the wind blew, and then they'd heat the hops, they'd dry them on a floor. And later on these were converted into beautiful homes, these conical shaped oast houses. So Celia and I, we'd have a month together. In those days, kids were allowed to roam the countryside. Nobody was worried about us. We'd borrow a horse from somebody, and we'd take turns. One of us rode a bike, one of us rode the horse, and we slung a bottle of lemonade. This was before plastic, so we had a glass bottle of lemonade hanging on the horse's neck, and we'd have sandwiches and some fruit, and we'd go and watch the local blacksmith shoe horses, or we'd go to a local farm and watch the farmer doing something with the cattle. And so we'd ride horses, we'd dare each other to go through, in the evening, to go through a churchyard. She was always braver than me. And I had a wonderful time. We'd sell apples. We'd collect apples from the orchard, and Celia always put a few of the bad ones in the bottom of the bag, and we'd cover them up with the good ones. And we'd sit there, 2 little girls, butter won't melt in our mouths, and people would come, cute little girls, and they'd pay us, 10 shillings or 5 shillings for a bag of apples. And we just had an enormous amount of fun.